Thank you.
Thank you.
We are here because for the first time in many years, the territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands.
Workers, business people, intellectuals, all sectors of national life are already gathered. The National Union seeking the well-being of the country and its dignity. If they want to come, let them. We'll give them a battle.
It was the year 1982, and the whole world had its eyes on several regions that were going through a great number of military and diplomatic conflicts. Although this was not the case for the South Atlantic region, whose waters were as calm and cold as ever. However, in April of that year, 1982, the peace of those waters was suddenly interrupted, which would soon escalate into a conflict of global diplomatic and media proportions. Some remote islands called the Malvinas or Falkland Islands, with sovereignty claimed by both Argentina and the United Kingdom. They would soon become the center of a new conflict that would echo through history and the shared memory of both nations, under the name of the Falklands War, with naval, air, and land battles that would continue to be talked about even several decades later. Join us today as we unravel the history of the Falklands War, its causes, its background, its events, and its particular outcome. My name is Alessandro Polentino, and this is the New Encyclopedia. But before we start with today's story, we invite you to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and commenting. We read them all. To share our videos with each of your friends and to turn on notifications, so you don't miss any of our upcoming releases. So, without anything else to add, let's begin today's story.
But before talking about the conflict triggered by Operation Rosario and the historical reasons behind the claims, both from Argentina and the United Kingdom, we have to go back a few centuries. The Malvinas Islands, or Falkland Islands, are an archipelago located in the South Atlantic Ocean, approximately 500 to 600 kilometers east of the Argentine Patagonian coast. The islands are mainly made up of two large islands, Soledad Island and Grand Malvinas Island, and several dozen smaller islands and islets. The dispute over the sovereignty of these islands begins with the debate over who arrived there first. It is believed that at the beginning of the 16th century, Spanish and Portuguese explorers may have sighted the islands. However, the first documented record of the islands is attributed to the English navigator John Davis in the year 1592. Thus, a few years later, in 1690, the Britishman John Strong landed on them and named them the Falkland Islands. Despite this, the colonization of these islands did not come from England but from France. In 1764, the French navigator Louis-Antoine de Bougainville founded the first colony at Puerto Soledad on Soledad Island. Shortly after the arrival of the French, Spain formally protested against them, claiming that the Malvinas were actually under its rule. According to the papal bull Inter Caetera, which dates back to the year 1493, and the treaties with Portugal from 1494. After these claims, France recognized the Spanish claim and transferred the settlement to the Spanish Empire in 1767. Spain, for its part, commands France will maintain control of the islands until 1811, when the garrison stationed there was withdrawn. Due to the crisis faced by the Spanish Empire in America because of the independence revolutions. Thus, when Argentina declared its independence in 1816, it inherited the territories of the former viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, including the Malvinas Islands. In 1820, the Argentine government sent people to the islands so that the French could reaffirm their sovereignty. Hewitt's proclamation was heard by foreign ships, consolidating the Argentine presence in the area. Later, in 1829, Argentina created the political and military command of the Malvinas Islands, appointing Luis Bernays as governor. Bernays established a prosperous settlement with significant fishing and livestock activities. However, in 1831, after the indiscriminate hunting of seals by American ships was banned, a North American frigate destroyed the Argentine facilities at Puerto Soledad. This event would be taken advantage of by the United Kingdom, which in 1833 sent the corvette Her Majesty's ship Clio to take control of the islands. The British expelled the Argentine garrison and consolidated their control, leaving behind a small population of settlers. From that moment on, Argentina began to consider this act as an illegitimate occupation and an affront to its sovereignty and international law. Over the years and on the eve of the conflict, both countries have defended their claims with different arguments. Argentina, for its part, bases its claim over the Malvinas Islands on a series of historical, legal, and political grounds. To begin with, the Argentines spoke of a so-called territorial inheritance, since the Malvinas were part of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. And when Argentina became independent from Spain, those lands became part of the new Argentine state. In addition to the historical territorial inheritance, there is also the effective presence on the island, since from 1810 to 1833, Argentina had governors in the Malvinas Islands, established local laws, and promoted economic activities. In plain words, Argentina exercised real, direct, and concrete sovereignty over the territory until the islands were occupied by force. Thus, for these reasons, the occupation of the islands by the United Kingdom was, for Argentina, a flagrant and clear violation of the principle of territorial integrity. On one hand, the British argued that before 1833, Argentina's presence on the islands was weak and did not exercise real control nor had international recognition. Furthermore, they invoked the right of occupation and prescription as the legal basis for their sovereignty, rejecting the validity of the Argentine claim derived from Spanish colonial succession after independence. However, one of the most important British arguments had to do with the population of the islands, since all of the approximately 1,800 inhabitants the island had by 1982, they identified themselves as British or Kelpers, that is, descendants of the British settlers who began to populate the island after the occupation in 1833. On the other hand, the British argued that since 1833, they had administered the territory without interruption, with a local government and a constant presence. And finally, the British emphasized the right to self-determination, arguing that according to the United Nations Charter of 1945, the islanders who identified the United Kingdom as their nation had the right to decide their political destiny and that this should be respected. Thus, over time, the international community, pressured by both the United Kingdom and Argentina, had recognized that the conflict existed. Years later, on September 16, 1965, the United Nations approved Resolution 2065, where it is recognized that there is a sovereignty dispute regarding the Malvinas or Falkland Islands, and both parties to the dispute are urged to negotiate. Thus, from the mid-1960s until the late 1970s, numerous diplomatic meetings were held between Argentina and the United Kingdom to try to resolve the conflict. However, none of these negotiations had any effect, since both countries stubbornly claimed that the islands belonged to them. After these events, arguments from both Argentina and the United Kingdom reached a boiling point. In the year 1982, which was also a crucial year for the politics of both countries. For its part, the United Kingdom was governed by the Conservative Party's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, nicknamed the Iron Lady. We invite you to watch our video about her on our channel. Thatcher, at the head of a nation that throughout history had used its military strength to subdue entire countries. She was going through a period of low popularity among the population due to social conflicts caused by her economic policies. This caused great discontent among large sectors of the population, especially among labor unions. Thus, Thatcher was waiting for some event that would allow her to overcome that disapproval and continue with her economic reforms. Meanwhile, Argentina was also experiencing tense times. Since the 1976 coup d'etat, Argentina had been governed by a military junta that was led by several members of the army, like Jorge Rafael Videla, about whom we also have a video on our channel, who started the so-called national reorganization process. However, by 1982, the junta was led by Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri, who was also the de facto president of the country. Galtieri, at the head of the Argentine government, was also facing a deep economic, social, and political legitimacy crisis that year, with growing public discontent. In this sense, in an attempt to unify society and regain its support, Galtieri and the military government began to see the recovery of the Malvinas as a possible nationalist cause, which would later awaken pride and contribute to improving the public image of the regime. Although, in the same way, the recovery of the Malvinas Islands was an old and genuine desire of the entire Argentine army, especially of Jorge Anaya, commander of the Argentine Navy. Anaya, who had been a classmate of Galtieri, offers him his full support. And what about the Argentine Navy? In exchange for a share of power and for seriously putting the issue of the Malvinas on the table. Even before Galtieri took office as president, Anaya had already ordered his subordinates to assess the feasibility of a military operation to recover the Malvinas Islands. Because in 1981, he had ordered Juan Jose Lombardo, the commander of naval operations, to assemble a task group to determine the viability of the operation. So by December 1981, when Galtieri became president and the members of the military junta were renewed, Galtieri himself remained as commander of the army, Anaya from the Navy, and Basilio Lamy II from the Air Force. The plan to recover the Malvinas Islands begins to be set in motion. The original idea was a non-violent takeover of the occupied Argentine territories. There were two possible scenarios that could later prove completely wrong. The first scenario was that the United Kingdom would not fight for the islands. Well, as we said, that country was facing a severe economic crisis. Therefore, it was considered very unlikely, or at least that's what the members of the junta thought, that the United Kingdom would fight to keep territories like the Falkland Islands, located more than 13,000 kilometers from London and inhabited by fewer than 1,500 people at that time. Such was the state of the British economy. Years earlier, in 1980, Nicholas Ridley, Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, had proposed a solution known as leaseback in light of the expenses generated by maintaining the Falkland Islands. This proposal involved formally transferring the sovereignty of the islands to Argentina, while the United Kingdom would lease them for a set period of time to handle their administration. However, this idea was met with strong resistance both from the islanders and from British parliamentarians, and ultimately, the idea did not succeed. In addition to this, around this time, the United Kingdom had considered the possibility of withdrawing the Her Majesty's ship Endurance, the only British naval patrol ship in the South Atlantic, from its position. This was interpreted by the Argentine military junta as yet another sign of the supposed British lack of interest in defending the islands. Another mistaken scenario anticipated by the members of the junta was the supposed neutrality that the United States would have in the conflict. They thought this because the Argentine military junta had been a strong United States ally against communism in the region, and this made them think that they indirectly had the approval of the North American nation. In addition, they believed that Washington was not interested in an armed conflict within the Western Bloc during the height of the Cold War. With these scenarios in mind, the planning team for the invasion of the Malvinas Islands was expanded to include high-ranking members of the Army and the Air Force. The planning was carried out in the strictest secrecy. The military airline Líneas Aéreas del Estado regularly operated flights to the Malvinas Islands. Vice Commodore Héctor Giloberto, representative of the ADE in Puerto Argentino, called Port Stanley by the British, had been gathering information for 4 years. The information gathered shows that the British garrison in the Malvinas Islands was made up of approximately 68 British soldiers, 11 naval hydrographers, and 23 volunteers from the Malvinas Islands Defense Force. In this regard, the task group concludes that a military operation to recover the islands is completely feasible. In the Argentine military government's initial plans, one of the symbolic dates considered to launch what was now called Operation Rosario was July 9, 1982, Argentina's Independence Day. The date, however, seems a bit far off, so May 15 is set as the deadline. However, an unexpected event suddenly alters Argentina's plans. Although most of the conflict, as will be seen later, actually takes place in the Malvinas Islands, there were also other islands known as the Georgias and Sandwich Islands, controlled by the British and located kilometers to the southeast of the Malvinas. And they would also play a role in this story on the eve of the conflict. The Argentine, Konstantin Davidov, gets a contract to dismantle old whaling facilities on the Georgias Islands and rents it to the Argentine Navy. The ship Bahia, Buen Suceso, to transport his workers, who upon arriving at Port Lade on March 18 located on those islands, raise an Argentine flag. Much has been speculated about this event. Many claim that the workers raised the flag spontaneously, surprising both the British and Argentine governments. Others assert that among the workers, there were members of the Argentine Navy who provoked the incident to further strain the already delicate situation. This event caused a major diplomatic crisis, leading the United Kingdom's forces to become alert to the situation in the South Atlantic, nor in a strong military response or the deployment of British ships and submarines. The military junta wanted to avoid a now or never situation. Finally, after this event, they decide to move the operation forward. And so, on March 28, 1982, troops from the Argentine Army and Navy boarded ships and set course for the Malvinas Islands. Under the orders of the operations commander, General Osvaldo Garcia, their only objective is to land and recover the Malvinas Islands once and for all. The Argentine fleet sails toward the islands with the intention of carrying out Operation Rosario on April 1st. However, due to adverse weather conditions, it is decided to postpone the landing to April 2nd. Thus, both Argentina and the United Kingdom found themselves on the brink of a major conflict that would forever mark the relationship between the two countries. Thus, on the night of April 1st, 1982, in complete darkness, the first groups of amphibious commandos and tactical divers prepared to carry out the mission. At 9:18 p.m., the silence on the high seas is broken when the first rubber boats detach from the destroyer, ARA, Santísima Trinidad. Under the command of Corvette Captain Guillermo Sanchez Zavarot's 84 elite men begin their advance toward the Malvinas coast. Minutes later, at 10:45 p.m., the main force of the amphibious command group departs in 19 inflatable boats, while the destroyer moves away to avoid being detected. The first Argentine fleet touched solid ground at Mullet Creek in the southeast of the Malvinas at 11 p.m. But these are not the only men in action. Meanwhile, the submarine ARA Santa Fe surfaces near the Cabo San Felipe lighthouse, releasing 10 tactical divers. Their mission is to place radio navigation beacons and secure the area for the subsequent landing of troops and vehicles. Despite all the measures taken by the Argentine government, The military movement quickly arouses suspicion about the invasion. At that very moment in London, Margaret Thatcher meets with her crisis cabinet. And the United States President Ronald Reagan, a close ally of Thatcher, calls Galtieri from Washington to dissuade him from carrying out a military attack. But the decision had already been made. Back in the Falklands, the British coastal vessel Forrest detects the movement of the submarine Santa Fe, alerting the British forces. At 11:40 p.m. on the same April 1st in the area of Puerto Argentino Airport, located in the northwest of the Falklands, a green flare briefly lights up the sky, and shortly after, the lights of San Felipe Lighthouse go out. The British were beginning to learn about the Argentine presence on the islands. The Argentine commandos, already on land, split into two main groups to carry out the next phase of the plan at 1:30 a.m. on April 2nd. Sanchez Savarotz's unit is in turn divided into two fronts. The first front, led by Sanchez Savarotz himself, has the task of heading to Moody Brook, southwest of the Malvinas, where the British soldiers are stationed, with the goal of surprising and neutralizing them before they can organize a counteroffensive. The second front, led by corvette captain Pedro Edgardo Giacchino, heads toward the capital of the islands, called Puerto Argentino, with the mission of taking the residence of the British governor, Rex Hunt, capturing him, and thus securing administrative control of the Malvinas. The order from the Argentine High Military Command is not to cause casualties among the limited British forces defending the islands, and even less to cause civilian casualties, because the Argentine government did not want to worsen the crisis with British casualties in order not to provoke a certain military response from London. The approach of Sanchez Avarotz's front to Moody Brook is carried out with extreme stealth. When they reach the barracks, the Argentines throw stun grenades and open fire on the British soldiers' barracks. However, they fail to achieve the planned surprise, since the British, alerted by unusual activity on the coast, had previously evacuated the barracks and were deployed in other defensive positions. In the capital and at the governor's house, in Puerto Argentino, also known as Port Stanley, the commandos, under the command of Chino the Guide, are in the vicinity of Governor Hunt's house, close to capturing the target. The strategy was to take the building quickly and without causing unnecessary casualties, following the order to minimize violence. However, the British are stationed there, and they were ready since the Argentinians had lost the element of surprise because of the noise from the explosions and gunfire. The gunfire caused by Sanchez Savarotz's front at Moody Brook, which had been heard in the capital. The first armed confrontation between Argentinians and British was about to begin. The British soldiers had taken up defensive positions and were not willing to give up control without a fight. Thus, British fire abruptly breaks the silence, forcing the Argentine commandos to temporarily fall back while they assess the situation. And Chino, along with his men, launches the assault on the governor's house. The Argentines try to force their way in, but they are met with intense fire from inside the building. Captain Guy Chino advances on the front line trying to gain ground, but in the exchange of gunfire he is hit by multiple shots. Wounded, he falls to the ground, but he stays alive. The confrontation becomes difficult for the Argentine forces, who must strictly follow the order not to cause any casualties. At that moment, and in that place, the Argentines were outnumbered by the defenders, since the bulk of the Argentine commandos had moved toward the barracks. In Moody Brook, despite the strong British offensive, the Argentine commandos hold their position in the governor's house. The fighting goes on for hours until Sanchez Savarotz's front, which as we saw was in Moody Brook, reaches the Argentine port, or Port Stanley, after marching 8 kilometers to join the siege of the governor's house. Meanwhile, not far away, on the beaches of the capital's airport, Argentine troops begin to land, deployed from the Jaracabo, San Antonio governor's house. After the arrival of Sanchez Savarotz's men, the situation becomes untenable for the British. Governor Rex Hunt, aware that the island was surrounded, makes the decision to surrender. Immediately afterwards, When the ceasefire order arrives, the Argentine commandos secure the residence. During the siege of the governor's house, 3 Argentine soldiers are wounded and Captain Giacchino, leader of the Second Front, is rushed to the island's hospital. But he does not make it. He survives, becoming the first casualty of the British-Argentine conflict in the Falklands. After the British surrender, the disembarked Argentine troops took to the streets of the capital. The images of the operation quickly spread around the world. The Argentine flag is raised and proudly waves once again in the Malvinas. Photos of the British surrendering are a major setback for the United Kingdom. But one photo in particular, the one of Soldier Alessio Batista, a member of the amphibious commando, with the surrendered British soldiers lined up. Many analysts say it becomes a symbol of humiliation for the British, a fact that will decisively influence London in favor of entering the war. However, the fighting was not over. The next day, in the early morning of April 3, 1982, the Argentine forces carried out a complementary operation in the South Georgia Islands, quickly taking control of the settlement of Gradviken and Port Leith. The British resistance in the area was made up of 22 British soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Keith Mills, who had taken up positions at Punta Celaya. After a brief confrontation in which only one of the defenders was wounded, the British Marines finally surrendered. In addition, another 13 men from the British Antarctic Research Team, who had taken refuge in the Church of Great Beacon, surrendered without resistance. In this way, Operation Rosario, completed in less than 3 days, ends with the capture of the Falkland Islands and South Georgia Islands by the Argentine army. They were promptly placed under its sovereignty and added to the national territory. However, the operation was not without losses for the victorious Argentina, as the fighting left 3 Argentine soldiers dead and a Puma helicopter was shot down in action. Even so, in Argentina, the news of their victory in the South Atlantic fills the population with joy and happiness. For their part, soon after, international negotiations begin, along with condemnations and support from various governments around the Argentine world. However, it remained to be seen what the response of the defeated and humiliated United Kingdom would be, which sooner rather than later will begin a series of military and diplomatic responses that will start one of the greatest conflicts of its time, which history will call the Falklands War.
After the successful execution of Operation Rosario and the re-establishment of Argentine control over the Falklands on April 3, 1982, worldwide condemnations and some support for Argentina's recovery of this territory quickly began. On the same day, April 3, the United Nations Security Council approved Resolution 502, urging Argentina to withdraw its troops and to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal. The United Kingdom proposed the resolution, which the United States strongly supported, providing diplomatic and military backing from the start. As we saw, the Argentine military junta did not anticipate this. Meanwhile, in the Organization of American States, after several days of intense sessions, on April the 26th, a resolution was approved recognizing Argentine sovereignty over the Malvinas Islands. The use of force by the United Kingdom is condemned, and the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance of 1912, known by its initials as Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, is invoked with the purpose that all American countries would support Argentina militarily in the face of this extracontinental aggression. The resolution is approved with 17 votes in favor, 4 abstentions from Colombia, Chile, Guyana, and Trinidad, and a single vote against that of the United States. Although the United States is part of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, it votes against the resolution and aligns itself with the United Kingdom. This is due to the diplomatic closeness and reasons of geopolitical interest between the United States President Ronald Reagan and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. While this occurs, nearly the rest of the continent, especially Peru and Venezuela, clearly support Argentina in the conflict. This is mainly because the United Kingdom had historically been an intervening and hostile nation toward most Hispanic American countries, not only in the military sphere, but also in the economic sphere. Other nations, like Venezuela with the Essequibo territory and Guatemala with the territory of Belize, had already experienced firsthand the English occupation of large areas of land. Consequently, it's worth noting the conflict that was beginning to develop in the Malvinas. According to some experts, it quickly takes on a Latin American connotation, highlighting that historical unity, which for some is very present, although for others it doesn't exist, from multiple American countries opposing foreign interference. In this sense, Peru, with President Fernando Balbán de Terry, not only provides political support, but also secretly sends planes and missiles to Argentina. He also suggested a diplomatic solution to the conflict, but London ultimately rejected it. Venezuela, led by President Luis Herrera, campaigns described by the Argentine press as, open quotes, a true statesman, close quotes. He breaks diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom and publicly condemns the British aggression, along with the validation of it by the United States, thus supporting Argentina in all international forums. Similarly, materials and equipment are secretly shipped from Venezuela to Argentina. But going back to the events in the Malvinas Islands on April 5, just 3 days after the Argentine recovery, the so-called task force sets sail from the United Kingdom, a huge contingent of men and equipment for the so-called British recovery of the islands. This force would consist of over 100 ships, including aircraft carriers, Her Majesty's ship Hermes and Her Majesty's ship Invincible, several destroyers, frigates, nuclear submarines such as Her Majesty's ship Conqueror, and logistical vessels. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, known for her tenacity in politics, is betting everything on an all-or-nothing approach. The British objective is clear: to isolate the Argentine forces, weaken their defensive capabilities, and force a surrender before the Southern Hemisphere winter. For their part, the British land force was made up of approximately 28,000 personnel, including regular troops, Marines, commandos, and paratroopers. However, international support for the United Kingdom is also decisive. The United States, as we know, will provide assistance in satellite intelligence, logistics, and supplies throughout the conflict. For its part, Chile also provides support to the United Kingdom, which has generated intense controversy over the years. It is believed that the reason behind Chile's support for the United Kingdom is that years earlier, in 1978, Argentina almost started a conflict with Chile over the sovereignty of the Picton, Lennox, and Nueva Islands. So the Chileans were concerned that after the recovery of the Malvinas, the Argentinians would set their sights on the disputed territories. For this reason, the Chileans immediately allied themselves with the United Kingdom, allowing the use of their radars and runways to track Argentine flights, giving the British a strategic advantage over the bases on the continent. This sparked a strong controversy between both nations that continues today. On the Argentine side, which still believes a diplomatic solution to the conflict is possible, a period of improvisation begins that will last throughout the war. The Argentine military junta, in its plans, did not consider the possibility of an open conflict under any circumstances. In this regard, after April 2nd, the Malvinas Islands were not properly reinforced with professional troops and adequate equipment to defend them. On the contrary, after Operation Rosario, almost all elite military units returned to the Argentine mainland. Thus, troops, mainly made up of young conscripts, were sent to the islands. These troops were stationed around the capital of the islands, called Puerto Argentino or Port Stanley. And as the days go by, they become worn out from the tension. The British bombings and the terrible weather conditions of wind, cold, and rain typical of the South Atlantic. In this sense, with the Malvinas Islands weakly protected, the British task force does not wait. And by the end of April, it appears in the cold waters of the South Atlantic to fight the Argentinians, whom they considered invaders. However, before talking about the conflict, let's take a short break to review the military forces that met in the South Atlantic in April 1982. First, the task force, which set sail from the United Kingdom on April 5. It was made up of 2 aircraft carriers, 8 destroyers, 15 frigates, 6 nuclear-powered submarines, 2 amphibious assault ships, and more than 6 troop landing vessels. In addition, the United Kingdom sent an auxiliary fleet made up of 75 ships in order to provide supplies and support to the task force. In total, there are 114 British ships arriving in the South Atlantic. This large military force contrasts with Argentina, which for its part had only 12 logistical vessels to support the troops during the battle. In turn, in terms of air power, most of the aircraft deployed by the United Kingdom operate from the island. Ascension is a small British territory in the Atlantic, nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Falkland Islands, which functions throughout the conflict as a logistical and resupply base for the British. There, they also meet with the Americans, who will provide the British forces with weapons and state-of-the-art equipment. At the same time, the British aircraft carriers also carry the so-called Sea Harriers, state-of-the-art fighter jets, which will dominate the skies over the South Atlantic. Throughout the conflict, these fighters will be armed with the lethal state-of-the-art Sidewinder missiles. However, despite the naval and air power, the large contingent of helicopters will be what makes the big logistical difference between the United Kingdom and Argentina. The United Kingdom sends 158 helicopters, including attack, troop transport, and cargo types. This is in contrast to the mere 26 helicopters that Argentina had available at that time. The large British naval force is split into 2 groups, one led by the aircraft carrier Hermes and the other by Invincible. Both are positioned several kilometers east of the Malvinas, and from there, British excursions and operations to the islands are commanded. The United Kingdom also declares a 200 nautical mile exclusion zone around the Malvinas Islands. This means that any ship or aircraft entering without authorization from the British government would be considered an enemy by the forces of that country. Thus, on May 1st, almost a month after Operation Rosario, the British task force begins bombing Argentine positions in the Malvinas Islands, formally starting the active phase of the conflict. In this context, the British Air Force carries out its first military operation in the Malvinas, called Operation Black Buck, one in which a Vulcan bomber takes off from Ascension Island and drops its explosive payload on the airport of Puerto Argentino, the capital of the islands, in a symbolic and strategic attack that leaves the airport partially unusable. That same day, aerial engagements begin between Argentine and British fighter jets. Tension had erupted into open war. On this first day of combat, the first confirmed downing of an Argentine aircraft also takes place, a Canberra reconnaissance plane, which is intercepted and destroyed by a British missile. This was how a real war began, with crossfire in the sky and naval skirmishes in the waters of the South Atlantic. With the conflict already underway, the first major blow for the Argentines comes from the depths. On May 1st, several groups of Argentine boats and ships deployed towards the Malvinas, but they do so outside the British exclusion zone, where undetectable British nuclear submarines already surrounded the islands. From the moment the Argentine vessels leave their continental bases, the British nuclear submarine Conqueror detects one of these groups of ships. The Argentinos island took off. You all see all the BAMOS and 2 radicals. You all almost see BAMOS. Mistakes. The exclusion zone poses a serious threat to the British fleet due to its technological capabilities. In this sense, the Prime Minister decides to sink it in international waters, generating a great legal and ethical controversy because of this decision. Thatcher's order reaches the nuclear submarine Conqueror, which launches several of its torpedoes. 2 of them hit the side and the bow of the large Argentine ship, causing chaos throughout the vessel. The sailors who survived the impact run and throw themselves into rafts in the icy waters of the South Atlantic. One of these sailors manages to survive. He takes several photographs of the Ara Belgrano as it sinks, which have gone down in history as some of the most famous photos of the conflict. In just a few minutes, the enormous Argentine ship sinks into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Of 1,093 crew members, 323 die, nearly half the casualties that the Argentine side will have throughout the entire war. The sinking of the Ara Belgrano has an effect that will mark the entire conflict, because the Argentine Navy, fearing new submarine attacks that they couldn't foresee, decides to withdraw to the continental ports and not go out again with its surface fleet. In this way, British naval superiority is practically consolidated for the remainder of the conflict. The British submarines, all nuclear, operate throughout the course of the war with almost unlimited autonomy. Meanwhile, the Argentine ships lack a modern anti-submarine warfare system and operate at a total disadvantage in every aspect. Thus, with the British fleet getting closer and closer to the Malvinas, the Argentine Air Force becomes the main defensive stronghold in the Malvinas. The Argentine ground forces were at the mercy of naval bombardments and the continuous harassment from the sea harriers. Furthermore, there was no major airport on the islands where the Argentine fighter jets could be stationed, and using aircraft carriers was no longer an option due to British superiority at sea. This forced the Argentinians to fight a significant part of the battle for the Malvinas in the air. Given this situation, the Argentine pilots and their Skyhawk, Mirage, Dagger, and Super Etendard fighters would have to fly back from their mainland bases in Argentina, more than 600 kilometers away from the Malvinas, with just a few minutes to attack and return before running out of fuel. In turn, the Argentine planes will face a British naval fleet equipped with advanced air defense systems and escorts, armed with Sea Dart and Sea Wolf anti-aircraft missiles. Besides these defensive methods, the United Kingdom also has those previously mentioned. Sea Harrier, a vertical takeoff aircraft deployed on the aircraft carriers, Her Majesty's ship Hermes, and Her Majesty's ship Invincible. The Sea Harrier aircraft, armed with Seawinder air-to-air missiles, perform remarkably. They shoot down more than 20 Argentine aircraft without suffering any losses in air combat. Their ability to take off from the deck, patrol constant areas, and operate with support from naval radars gives them total control of the airspace over the Malvinas. Argentine Air Force and naval aviation plans did not include sea combat, because neither the Argentine pilots nor the jets were prepared to face the British ships. However, despite their obvious limitations, Argentina manages to inflict heavy blows on the British Navy. For example, on May 4th, an Argentine reconnaissance plane detects 2 English ships southwest of the Falklands. After this, 2 Super Etendard fighter jets take off from Argentina, each equipped with a fearsome Exocet missile. The Exocet missiles, of French manufacture, were designed to fly at very low altitude, almost skimming the sea, which made them extremely difficult to detect and neutralize. One of the main technological advantages of these missiles is that they had an active radar in their own seeker head. This allowed them, once launched, to guide themselves toward their target without needing further guidance from the aircraft, which increased their accuracy and lethality. Argentina then had just 5 of these units. Thus, the Argentine fighter Super Ethan Dark detects the British destroyer Her Majesty's ship Sheffield. After flying low over the sea and receiving in-flight refueling, the Argentine fighter fires a single exocet. The missile hits the side of the Sheffield. The impact and resulting fire prove fatal. The ship sinks days later, killing 21 Britons. This was, in fact, the first major British loss during the war. From that moment on, the Exocet missile became a symbol of real threat to the British fleet. Despite limited missiles, Argentina showed it could hit and damage high-value targets at sea. However, one of the main technical tragedies for the Argentinians was that many of the bombs dropped by their planes did not end up exploding. The Argentine Air Force fighter jets did not have proper anti-ship weaponry, since the bombs they had were designed for land targets, in this regard to avoid being detected and shot down by the sophisticated radars of the British ships, and to be able to inflict some damage. The Argentine pilots are forced to fly at very low altitude and drop these bombs almost at water level, which does not give the fuse mechanism enough time to arm before impact. During these maneuvers, Argentine pilots display skill and bravery by flying just meters above the sea and directly facing anti-aircraft fire from large British ships. Even so, despite the tremendous efforts of the Argentine pilots, more than a dozen British vessels are hit by bombs that simply did not detonate. Had they done so, the British costs during the war would have been much higher. The scenes were somewhat frustrating for the Argentinians. The pilots were doing their part with incredible surgical precision, but the available military technology was not much help. Though most bombs didn't detonate, some exploded, causing havoc among the enemy. For example, on May 12th, a group of Argentine Skyhawk fighters took off, as usual, from the mainland bases heading to the islands. They fly low over the sea to avoid detection by British ships and sea harriers. The Argentine Skyhawks detect two targets, the Her Majesty's ship Brilliant and the Her Majesty's ship Glasgow, which are withdrawing after bombing Argentine ground positions on the islands. The Argentine Skyhawks attacked to set fire to Malvinas. They pulled back after a bombing run. It was bulldozer. A moment that shows Suno within. Followers appeared. Invading the Malvinas masks the disappointing truth that the Argentine Air Force and naval aviation can't sustain the war effort. The lack of replacement aircraft, the loss of trained pilots, the shortage of modern radars, and the lack of real-time tactical intelligence undermine Argentina's offensive capability. During the conflict, many aircraft operate with little electronic support, fly missions without knowing the fleet's exact location, lack Navy coordination, and have almost no margin for error. Many of them are shot down by missiles or by British anti-aircraft fire. Another major strategic mistake that results from the Argentine efforts is the lack of a joint military doctrine between the Air Force and the Navy for the conflict. Instead of planning combined operations, both branches of the military operate separately, duplicating efforts and missing numerous valuable opportunities. In contrast to this reality, the British have onboard command centers, satellite communications, real-time intelligence, and guaranteed air superiority thanks to the sea harriers and the radars on their ships. Added to this are anti-aircraft systems that, although not infallible, created exclusion zones that were inaccessible to the Argentinians over key areas. Meanwhile, the Argentine ground forces in the Malvinas knew that not everything would remain in the air and at sea, and that the landing of British troops on the islands was imminent. Thus, the Argentine officers awaited the landing near Puerto Argentino to the east of the islands. Thus, around May 20th, the British cruisers with the troops began to move from their position at sea toward the Malvinas. However, the British did not land where the Argentinians thought they would, as they did so at the San Carlos Strait to the west of the islands. The following day, that is May 21st. Although there were still battles to be fought in the air and at sea, from this date onward, the future of the war would be decided on the ground of the islands themselves. In this sense, the war soon changes phase. The aerial and naval inferno shifts to trenches and hand-to-hand combat, marking the start of ground fighting for the Malvinas. The Argentinians, who had struggled against the English in the air and at sea, now they await the imminent landing of British troops on the islands to begin the ground combat. However, the big problem is knowing exactly where that English landing would take place. The Argentine generals in charge of military operations are waiting for the British on the beaches around the capital of the islands, the well-known Puerto Argentino. That is why, around the capital, where the bulk of the troops are stationed, mainly on the hills and mountains outside the city, there are only a few smaller regiments in more remote areas. The British, who had been bombing and shelling with their ships for days. The Argentine positions know the capital is surrounded and don't want to risk anything. Therefore, the British decide to land their troops in San Carlos Bay in the northeast of Soledad Island and almost 25 kilometers away from the capital, Puerto Argentino. This is with the purpose of quietly leaving from there to begin their ground campaign. However, in the early morning of May 21, 1982, around 2 a.m., Argentine sentries stationed in San Carlos Bay, they detect unusual movements in the water. They observe and hear British landing ships approaching the coast. Some engines and helicopters can also be heard. The Argentine forces in the area are quite limited, if not non-existent. There is only a small detachment from the Army and the National Gendarmerie present. They report by radio to the Central Command in Puerto Argentino about the beginning of the British landing. But communication is limited and confusing due to the terrain conditions and the available equipment. In San Carlos Bay, the soldiers try to harass the British troops with small arms fire, but when they find themselves outmatched, they retreat inland. The weak defense there lets the British establish themselves quickly. A beachhead, which is the military term used to define a coastal point taken by invading forces to wait for the arrival of reinforcements. The Argentine forces, mostly stationed far from San Carlos Bay, do not have the operational capacity to repel the landing. So only the Air Force and the Navy's fighter jets are left to try to stop the British advance, which begins sooner rather than later. Thus, on May 20th itself, Argentine air attacks on the British fleet, concentrated in San Carlos Bay, begin, thus starting the bloody air-naval battle of San Carlos. In many waves, Argentine planes take off from mainland bases to attack the British ships, flying low over the sea. For their part, the Argentine defense ships are positioned in the San Carlos Strait, while the British ships carrying landing troops are located inside the narrow San Carlos Bay itself, where they are protected by the fjords, hills, and elevations of the area. For 5 consecutive days, from May 21 to May 25, there are constant attacks by Argentine Skyhawk, Daher, and Mirage planes. While the landing craft leave the ships, the planes fly low over the sea, dropping their bombs, many of which do not detonate but still damage the hulls and equipment of the British ships. During that time, the Argentine forces managed to score significant hits on the British ships, sinking the Her Majesty's ship Ardent and Her Majesty's ship Antelope, and putting the Argonaut ships out of action, Brilliant Bortsworth, Sir Galak, and Sir Lancelot. In total, several ships are damaged and 2 are sunk. This forces the British to adjust their logistics, disperse their fleet, and strengthen their anti-aircraft defenses. However, the cost for the Argentine forces. The Paras die like water, the Republican zone. They were the ones who led the Italian balls in the south. More than 1 million houses of the loose European rifles. More likely than that of the tavern, which was due to the rapid success of the British landing. One of the few attacks inside the bay is recorded by a British camera already landed, leaving one of the most iconic records of the battle. So, despite the attempts of the Argentine defense, the British soldiers secure the landing area. They establish defensive perimeters and effectively consolidate their beachhead to prepare for the next land campaign. In this sense, with all British troops already landed and consolidated, the English army begins its march toward Puerto Argentino. However, before going to the capital, the British encounter an obstacle. To the south of the Malvinas, there is an 8-kilometer-long area called Pradera del Ganso. There, approximately 1,000 men from the Argentine army are stationed, and they are tasked with taking control of the grassland from the 2nd Battalion of British paratroopers. The Argentine troops, mostly made up of young conscripts, have been waiting for the enemy attack for weeks. In Goose Green and in all their positions in the Falklands, the Argentine soldiers have tirelessly dug foxholes and trenches. But the harsh weather conditions, the cold, the rain, and the lack of food and shelter have worn them down tremendously. Some Argentine soldiers even hunt sheep to eat them, breaking the discipline of the Argentine army. They suffer harsh punishments from officers, further hurting troop morale. So when the British attack is already imminent, the Argentines are at their limit. On the morning of May 28th, the British arrive and, after a 4-hour bombardment of Argentine positions, launch their attack. Nighttime gunfire quickly surrounds the Argentine army's most advanced positions. The Argentinians retreat, leaving dead and wounded across the field. Argentine artillery positioned in the rear begins shelling the area, but without a clear observation post, because the missiles hit both friend and foe. The British advance quickly, and the Argentinians withdraw from the northern part of the isthmus. With daylight already upon them, the shooting breaks out again, with groups of Argentinians positioned in the rear in better positions. This time, the resistance is much stronger, and the British are forced to temporarily halt their advance. Due to the strong Argentine defense, other British groups join the fight from the flanks, causing the Argentine troops to retreat once again toward the isthmus village, where they begin shelling the British positions, but are unable to stop the advance. So the Argentines are completely surrounded in Goose Green. Night falls, and in the early morning of May 29, the Argentines decide to surrender. Thus, in the morning hours, the Argentine troops hand over their weapons, and the Battle of Goose Green ends with 17 British dead and 56 wounded, and 46 Argentines dead and 101 wounded. After the intense and bloody Battle of Goose Green, the British forces begin their final advance toward Port Stanley. But the road is far from simple. To reach the capital, they first have to conquer a series of strategic hills that formed a natural defensive belt around the city, El Griso. Argentine forces are stationed on every hill and rock around the capital. The British have in mind to begin the advance with their troop transport helicopters. However, the Argentines respond with another hard blow to the British fleet. The Argentines still had 2 of the dangerous Exocet missiles in their hands. To make use of them, the Air Force seeks to deliver a major blow, and that is to manage to sink one of the British aircraft carriers. Thus, on May 25th, the day when Argentina celebrates its National Day, 2 Super Etendard aircraft from the Argentine Navy detect several vessels east of the Falkland Islands and lock onto a large target on their radars. In this regard, flying at low altitude and with precise coordination, the Argentine fighter jets launched the 2 remaining Exocet missiles at the British aircraft carrier. Several British ships defend the British aircraft carrier in different lines, so the Exocet missiles did not hit the aircraft carrier. But one of the missiles does hit the side of the Atlantic conveyor directly, and within minutes the ship becomes a fire trap. This large British logistics ship was carrying helicopters that were essential for the rapid movement of troops and supplies across the rugged terrain of the Malvinas. The Argentine attack also resulted in the loss of vehicles, spare parts, tents, generators, and a large portion of the logistical material that the United Kingdom needed to sustain its offensive. The attack was so severe that Admiral John Woodward, commander of the British task force in the Malvinas, stated in his memoirs that this would be one of the hardest blows received during the war and one of the worst days of his military career. Returning to the British after the attack on the convoy, they were forced to rethink their ground advance. Without enough helicopters, they can no longer quickly deploy units from San Carlos to the high ground surrounding Puerto Argentino. Now, instead of moving by air, the British troops have to march on foot for days, crossing peat bogs, hills, and vast open ground without cover. This is a titanic effort under harsh weather conditions, carrying the weight of their equipment and facing the constant risk of ambushes or enemy fire. For their part, the Argentine forces, although battered, deal heavy blows to the British ground advance. Amphibious commandos and soldiers of the Argentine National Gendarmerie arrive on May 29, and as the British advance, their mission is now to deploy behind the advancing lines and attack from the rear. Several clashes take place near the main rocky elevations of the islands, where the Argentines manage to slow down the advance, but they are repelled by British fire. 2 days later, on May 30, 1982, one of the most controversial events occurred, which continues to generate debate to this day. The Argentine Air Force, desperate to stop the British advance at all costs, launches a combined operation against the British aircraft carrier, Her Majesty's ship Invincible. In this regard, 2 Argentine Super Étendard aircraft, armed with an Exocet missile and several Skyhawk escort and attack planes, are sent with a mission to sink the Her Majesty's ship Invincible. According to the Argentine version, the missile hits and severely damages the ship, and it is even suggested that it may have sunk. Several photographs and accounts from the pilots seem to support that claim. The United Kingdom, for its part, categorically denies any damage to the Her Majesty's ship Invincible. Their reports indicate that the missile did not hit the target and that the Invincible continued operating. Momentarily, the Invincible withdraws from combat, but this temporary withdrawal of the aircraft carrier, the British claim, was due to a scheduled turbine replacement carried out at sea. Decades later, research and specialized publications conclude that there is no solid evidence that the Invincible was hit, while the Argentine forces maintain that it was even sunk. The Her Majesty's ship, Invincible, generated quite a bit of debate, since the narrative of the war was extremely important both in London and in Buenos Aires. And how were the facts presented from each point of view to the international community? Going back to the events, once again in the air, on June 8th, the Argentine Air Force claims another devastating blow to the British, one that this time will be impossible to deny. The logistics ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, which were carrying supplies and Welsh Guards troops, had moved ahead toward Port Stanley to support the final advance. Both ships were anchored in Bluff Cove, called Boothclough in English, which was an inlet located to the west of the capital, due to delays in the landing and local decisions. The script of the "You are the destination of the joke too. Time of receipt Deutsche Omatic. The imposing Herver, removing the rude expressions. The explosions on the Sir Galahad spread quickly due to the presence of fuel and ammunition, resulting in a total of 56 deaths. On the British side, mostly Welsh soldiers, and leaving more than 180 wounded, many of them with severe burns. The ship Sir Tristram, also targeted in the attack, suffers severe and irreversible structural damage. This was perhaps the darkest day for the British fleet during the entire conflict. and at the time it was the most serious incident of loss of life in a conflict for the British since World War II. These events involving the ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram caused a slowdown in the British offensive, although the advance was still irreversible. But even so, the Argentine positions are well fortified, especially on Mount Longdon, Dos Hermanas, Harriet, Tumbledown, William, and Wireless Ridge. So in these places, the battles to come will be neither quick nor clean. In this sense, the night of June 11, 1982, marks the beginning of the coordinated assault by the British. The first objective is Mount Longdon, a key position to the northwest of the capital, Port Stanley. There, B Company of the 7th Argentine Infantry Regiment is determinedly resisting the advance of the 3rd Battalion of British paratroopers. In complete darkness, the British soldiers fix bayonets to their rifles. They approach stealthily until one of them steps on a mine that explodes loudly. Immediately, the Argentinians come out of their foxholes and tents, and a hellish firefight breaks out. The fighting is quite fierce because in the middle of a mined area, the confrontation degenerates into hand-to-hand combat, with explosions and gunfire going in all directions in the middle of the darkness. At times, the British troops lose the momentum of the attack. The Argentine forces establish a strong defense, but after long hours of fighting, the British take control of Mount Longdon in the early morning of June 12, in what some consider the bloodiest battle of the entire war. At the same time this occurred at Mount Longdon, west of the islands. The Battle of Two Sisters is taking place, where the 45th English Commando advances toward defensive positions of. The terrain is treacherous and the defenses on both sides are well distributed. However, after intense fighting, the English managed to take control of Mount Two Sisters near dawn, just as their compatriots do at Mount Longdon. The resistance was strong, but little by little the Argentine defensive lines are being broken. At the same time, to the south, the English of the 42nd Commando carry out a flanking maneuver on Mount Gerrier. With meticulous planning and artillery support, the British advance at night, surprising much of the Argentine defense. There are also intense battles there, shots fired from the rocks, and close-range encounters. But even so, the Argentine soldiers surrender to the British advance. So, just like at Mount Longdon and Two Sisters Mountain, the mount falls shortly before dawn. Thus, the morning of June 12 dawns, with Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Gerrier under absolute British control. The Argentine defensive belt was beginning to crumble, and Port Stanley is now within English reach, although there are still some battles left to fight. On June 13, British troops begin the assault on Mount Thomas, defended by the 5th Infantry Regiment of the Argentine Army. The English attack is led by the Scots Guards, famous elite units with experience in urban and mountain combat. The confrontation becomes one of the fiercest battles of the entire war, with hand-to-hand combat that lasts throughout the night. The Argentine positions put up solid resistance, but weeks of fighting, the extreme cold, and the constant pressure from British artillery take a toll on the defense. Meanwhile, the offensive unfolds at the site of Wireless Ridge, on the easternmost edge of the islands. Defended by the 7th Argentine Infantry Regiment, the British troops, mainly from the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, attack with massive artillery and naval gunfire support. The battle is brief but intense. The Argentine defenders, outgunned, are forced to withdraw. Finally, Mount Wireless Ridge falls into British hands that same night. These are, unbeknownst to the Argentines, the last battles they will be able to fight in the Malvinas. Throughout the entire war, which was about to experience the overwhelming British advance, so going back to the events, Zapper Hill, the last elevation before Puerto Argentina, was also fortified by the Argentines. But after the loss of Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge, the position was left exposed to an imminent British attack. Therefore, the Argentine defenders began an orderly withdrawal toward Puerto Argentino, while the British troops advanced from the heights and surrounded the city. Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez, the Argentine commander on the islands, is under heavy pressure from the military junta in Buenos Aires to fight until the end. In the city, house by house and street by street if necessary. However, such an order is impossible to carry out, since with the capital surrounded on the verge of collapse and the troops completely wounded and exhausted, on June 14, 1982, Brigadier General Menendez accepted the unconditional surrender before General Jeremy Moore, the commander in the conflict. In this sense, the Argentine capitulation, considered by some as humiliating and outrageous, but by others as fair and necessary, is signed. That same day, more than 10,000 Argentine soldiers laid down their arms, officially marking the end of the conflict. Thus, the Argentine flag is lowered from the mast in Puerto Argentino and is immediately replaced by the flag of the English Union. The Falklands War lasted a total of 74 days and left a deep mark on the history and collective memory of Argentina. In the United Kingdom, it was a brief conflict, but it cost the lives of 649 Argentine soldiers, 255 British soldiers, and 3 island civilians. Despite the time that has passed, the sovereignty conflict over the Malvinas remains unresolved. For its part, Argentina maintains its claim over the islands, supported by numerous resolutions from the organization that urge both parties to resume dialogue. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom, for its part, maintains its military and administrative presence on the islands, under the argument of the islanders' right to self-determination. Today, more than 4 decades after the conflict, the memory of those who fell remains alive and as intense as on the first day. And the Argentine claim, just for some and unthinkable for others, remains a national cause for the southern country. Meanwhile, for the distant United Kingdom, the matter of those remote islands is seen as settled. After having made dazzling use of its military, it has very little chance of being reopened. Dear friends, thank you for watching until the end. We hope you enjoyed it. We remind you that your support is essential for the growth of this great project. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for our upcoming releases. See you next time.